In the winter of 1852, a traveling daguerreotype photographer captured an image that would remain hidden in a private collection for over 170 years. The photograph showed a well-dressed white woman surrounded by 12 children of varying ages and skin tones, all positioned in front of a grand plantation house in rural Mississippi. When the image finally surfaced at an estate auction in 2019, genealogists and historians noticed something deeply disturbing: the woman's posture, the children's haunted expressions, and handwritten notes on the photograph's reverse side that read simply, "Eleanor's brood, God forgive us." What began as a curious historical find transformed into a revelation of systematic abuse, forced reproduction, and a conspiracy of silence that lasted generations. Eleanor Whitmore, the obese and unmarried daughter of plantation magnate Thomas Whitmore, had never appeared in census records as a mother. Yet the photograph told a different story, one of 12 children who shared her features but varied dramatically in complexion. Archival researchers soon discovered that Eleanor's father had orchestrated something far more sinister than anyone initially suspected: a breeding program designed to increase his enslaved labor force while keeping his daughter confined to the plantation grounds, hidden from society's judgment. The discovery sent shockwaves through the historical community and opened a Pandora's box of buried documents, sealed court records, and oral histories passed down through generations of descendants who had been told never to speak of their origins. Behind the faded image lay a story of exploitation, medical complicity, legal manipulation, and a cover-up that reached the highest levels of Mississippi society. The 12 children in that photograph had been deliberately erased from official records, their births unregistered, their existence denied by the very family that profited from their labor. What experts found went beyond a single case of abuse. It revealed an entire system designed to exploit both enslaved people and white women, deemed unfit for marriage, transforming them into instruments of profit. Eleanor Whitmore's tragedy became a window into the darkest corners of plantation economics, where human beings were treated as livestock and bloodlines were manipulated for financial gain. The silence that surrounded her case for 170 years was not accidental. It was engineered, enforced, and maintained by everyone who benefited from keeping the truth buried. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. Chapter 1. The photograph that refused to stay hidden. The photograph appeared at a routine estate sale in Natchez, Mississippi, in late October 2019. Among boxes of tarnished silverware, yellowed linens, and crumbling furniture, auction attendees barely noticed the small daguerreotype tucked inside a leather portfolio. The estate belonged to Martha Whitmore Carlisle, the last surviving descendant of one of Mississippi's most prominent antebellum families. When she died at 97, childless and alone, her possessions were liquidated to settle debts owed to the county hospital. Dr. Rebecca Thornton, a genealogist specializing in antebellum Southern families, purchased the portfolio for $35. She was searching for documentation related to the Whitmore family tree, which had frustrated researchers for decades due to inexplicable gaps and contradictions in official records. What she found inside the portfolio changed everything she thought she knew about plantation documentation and the lengths wealthy families would go to protect their reputations. The photograph itself was remarkably well preserved for its age. It showed a corpulent white woman seated in an ornate chair, wearing an expensive dark dress that strained against her considerable frame. Her face carried an expression that Dr. Thornton would later describe as profoundly sad, almost catatonic. Arranged around her in a careful composition were 12 children ranging from approximately 4 to 16 years old. Their clothing varied dramatically. Some wore simple homespun garments typical of enslaved children, while others wore better quality clothes that suggested intermediate status. But it was the children's faces that arrested Dr. Thornton's attention. Each child shared unmistakable facial features with the seated woman: the same broad forehead, the distinctive shape of the nose, the set of the eyes. Yet their skin tones ranged from pale cream to deep brown, suggesting a racial mixing that official plantation records consistently denied. The careful arrangement suggested a formal family portrait, yet no such family existed in any census, birth record, or property inventory from the Whitmore plantation. The handwritten notation on the reverse side provided the first clue. Eleanor's brood, God forgive us, T.W., Spring, 1852. The initials matched Thomas Whitmore, one of Mississippi's wealthiest plantation owners, who owned over 300 enslaved people across 2 properties. But who was Eleanor, and why did her brood require divine forgiveness? Dr. Thornton began her investigation cautiously, starting with basic genealogical research. Thomas Whitmore had 3 documented children, 2 sons who inherited portions of the plantation, and 1 daughter named Eleanor, born in 1825. Census records showed Eleanor living at her father's residence until his death in 1868, but she was consistently listed as unmarried and childless. There were no marriage records, no property transfers to her name, and no mention of children in any official capacity. It was as if the woman in the photograph had been deliberately erased from documented history, existing only in the family's private memory. The breakthrough came when Dr. Thornton examined county court records from the late 1860s. Buried in probate documents related to Thomas Whitmore's estate was a peculiar notation about special provisions made for his daughter Eleanor's dependents and their descendants. The legal language was deliberately vague, using terms like individuals under her care rather than children or offspring. The document allocated a small parcel of land and modest financial support to these unnamed individuals, but only on the condition that they never publicly claim relation to the Whitmore family name. Further investigation revealed that Eleanor Whitmore had been described in private correspondence as afflicted with corpulence and melancholia from a young age. Her father's letters to family members referred to her as unmarriageable and expressed concern about her future after his death. There were mentions of her being confined to the house for her own protection and kept away from social gatherings where eligible suitors might be present. The letters painted a picture of a young woman isolated, controlled, and deliberately kept from the normal social interactions expected of someone from her class. What Dr. Thornton found next would crack open the entire case. In the archives of a now-defunct Baptist church that once served the Whitmore plantation community, she discovered baptismal records that had been overlooked for over a century. Between 1842 and 1856, 12 children were baptized under deliberately ambiguous entries. Their mother was listed simply as E.W. with no surname. Their fathers were recorded as unknown or left blank. The baptismal dates corresponded roughly to the ages of the children in the photograph. Each child had been given the surname Freeman, a common name assigned to formerly enslaved people, yet these baptisms occurred before emancipation. The church records included a note from the reverend who performed the baptisms, written decades later in 1889. I performed these rites under duress from Mr. Whitmore, who insisted these children be recognized by God if not by man. The circumstances of their births weighed heavily on my conscience, but I was powerless to intervene in matters beyond the church's authority. May the Lord have mercy on us all for our silence. The Reverend's cryptic confession raised more questions than it answered. What circumstances required divine mercy? Why were the children's births kept from official records but acknowledged in church baptisms? And what had Thomas Whitmore orchestrated that required both secrecy and spiritual absolution? Chapter 2. The Whitmore Legacy and Eleanor's Imprisonment. The Whitmore Plantation, known as Belmead, sprawled across 2,000 acres of prime Mississippi Delta cotton land. Thomas Whitmore had inherited the property from his father in 1820 and transformed it into one of the region's most profitable operations. By 1850, Belmead was producing over 400 bales of cotton annually, worked by more than 300 enslaved people whose labor generated immense wealth for the Whitmore family. The plantation's success made Thomas one of the most influential men in the county, with connections to state legislators, judges, and other plantation elite. But behind Belmead's imposing Greek Revival mansion and manicured gardens, Thomas Whitmore harbored a problem that threatened both his social standing and his carefully cultivated reputation. His only daughter, Eleanor, had been born in 1825 with what period documents euphemistically called constitutional weakness. Modern analysis of surviving descriptions suggests she likely suffered from what we now recognize as severe depression, combined with metabolic disorders that caused significant weight gain from childhood. In the rigid social hierarchy of antebellum Mississippi, marriageable daughters were essential assets for maintaining and expanding family wealth and influence. Young women from elite families were expected to marry well, producing heirs and forming strategic alliances with other prominent families. But Eleanor's physical appearance and melancholic temperament made her unmarriageable by the cruel standards of the time. Letters from family friends delicately inquired about potential suitors, and Thomas's responses grew increasingly defensive and evasive. By Eleanor's 20th birthday in 1845, Thomas had made a fateful decision. Rather than continue the humiliating charade of seeking suitors who would inevitably reject his daughter, he would keep her permanently at Belmead, away from society's judgmental gaze. Contemporary accounts from neighboring plantations noted Eleanor's absence from social gatherings where she had previously appeared. One letter from a family acquaintance mentioned that Eleanor had taken ill and requires constant care at home, a convenient fiction that would be maintained for decades. What truly transpired behind Belmead's walls remained hidden until Dr. Thornton's research uncovered a series of letters between Thomas Whitmore and his brother-in-law, Judge Marcus Pemberton, who lived in Vicksburg. Written between 1842 and 1845, these letters revealed Thomas's growing desperation about Eleanor's future. In one particularly revealing exchange from November 1844, Thomas wrote, "Eleanor will never marry, and I cannot bear to see her sent to an institution. Yet I must ensure the continuation of my labor force. Perhaps there is a way to solve both problems simultaneously, though it requires compromises with conventional morality." Judge Pemberton's response came 6 weeks later, and its contents were chilling in their calculated pragmatism. He advised Thomas that Mississippi law provided considerable latitude for plantation owners to manage their domestic affairs without outside interference. He suggested that Eleanor could serve the plantation's interests while remaining hidden from public view. The judge even recommended a specific overseer named Silas Blackwood, known for his discretion and willingness to follow unconventional orders without question. Silas Blackwood arrived at Belmead in early 1845 and quickly became Thomas's most trusted employee. Contemporary descriptions painted him as a harsh, calculating man who ruled the plantation's enslaved population with calculated cruelty. But his relationship with Thomas Whitmore went beyond normal overseer duties. Private account books discovered in the Whitmore family papers showed Blackwood receiving extraordinary compensation, nearly 5 times the typical overseer's salary, with cryptic notations about special services and discretionary management. The first of Eleanor's children was born in late 1842, before Blackwood's arrival, suggesting that Thomas's plan had been set in motion even earlier. Birth records were deliberately omitted from county registers, and no doctor's name appeared in family papers related to the delivery. Local midwives who might have attended were enslaved women who could be silenced through threats and coercion. The child, a boy with light brown skin, was never given Eleanor's surname and disappeared into the plantation's slave quarters, his maternal connection deliberately obscured. Between 1842 and 1856, Eleanor gave birth 12 times. Each child was the result of forced encounters that period documents euphemistically described as a breeding program. While explicit details were carefully scrubbed from official records, fragmentary evidence painted a horrifying picture. Thomas Whitmore selected specific enslaved men, those he considered strong, intelligent, and healthy, to father children with his daughter. These men had no choice in the arrangement. Refusal meant severe punishment or sale to brutal work gangs in the Deep South. Eleanor herself was essentially a prisoner in her father's house. Servants who worked at Belmead in the late 19th century, decades after slavery's end, shared oral histories passed down from their parents and grandparents. These accounts described Eleanor as a broken woman who rarely left her second-floor suite of rooms. She was attended constantly by enslaved women who reported her every movement to Thomas and later to her brothers. Her meals were brought to her rooms, and she was forbidden from developing close relationships with anyone, including her own children. The children born from this arrangement occupied a strange liminal space in plantation hierarchy. They were technically enslaved, lacking legal recognition as Eleanor's offspring or Thomas's grandchildren, yet they received better clothing, education, and treatment than field workers. Some were trained in skilled trades, carpentry, blacksmithing, textile work, making them valuable assets. Others worked as house servants, their lighter skin and refined manners marking them as distinct from other enslaved people. But they were forbidden from acknowledging their maternal connection, and Eleanor was prohibited from displaying maternal affection toward them. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. Chapter 3. The System Behind the Silence. What made Eleanor Whitmore's exploitation possible was not just one man's cruelty, but an entire system designed to protect elite white families while maximizing profit from enslaved labor. Thomas Whitmore's scheme existed within a legal and social framework that granted plantation owners near absolute authority over everything that occurred on their property, with minimal oversight or accountability. Understanding the system reveals how such horrors could occur in plain sight, while leaving almost no documentary trail. Mississippi law in the antebellum period granted plantation owners extraordinary power over enslaved people, treating them as property rather than human beings. But the law also provided significant control over white family members, especially women. Elite white women existed in a state of legal dependency, with fathers and later husbands controlling their property, movements, and life decisions. An unmarried woman like Eleanor had virtually no legal autonomy. She couldn't own property, enter contracts, or live independently without male permission. This legal framework created a perfect prison for Eleanor. Her father controlled her inheritance, her living arrangements, and even her ability to seek help from outside authorities. Any attempt to expose what was happening would have been met with legal and social consequences. Society expected women, especially unmarried women, to remain silent and obedient to male family authority. Speaking out would have brought shame on Eleanor herself, not her father, and she had no independent means of survival if she left Belmead. Thomas Whitmore also cultivated relationships that ensured institutional complicity in his scheme. His brother-in-law, Judge Pemberton's advice wasn't unusual. Judges, lawyers, and doctors throughout the antebellum South regularly helped wealthy families conceal embarrassing secrets. When Eleanor's children were born, no birth certificates were filed with county clerks. When deaths occurred among enslaved people who knew too much, no investigations followed. The entire apparatus of local government operated to protect men like Thomas Whitmore, not the people he exploited. Medical professionals played a particularly sinister role in maintaining the silence. Dr. Thornton's research uncovered payment records showing Thomas Whitmore regularly employed a physician named Dr. Cornelius Mitchell, who traveled from Vicksburg to attend to private family matters at Belmead. Dr. Mitchell's surviving ledgers, discovered in a medical college archive, contained cryptic entries about deliveries and consultations regarding hereditary matters at the Whitmore plantation. These entries corresponded to the years when Eleanor's children were born. Dr. Mitchell's personal correspondence revealed his awareness that something improper was occurring at Belmead. In an 1848 letter to a medical colleague, he wrote, "I am called regularly to attend to delicate situations at a certain plantation, where the patriarch's daughter requires my discretion as much as my medical skill. The moral implications trouble me, but I am compensated handsomely for my silence. In our profession, we often witness family secrets that must remain inviolate." His discretion was purchased for substantial fees, 3 times what he charged for normal obstetric care, ensuring his complicity in concealing Eleanor's successive pregnancies and births. The enslaved community at Belmead knew the truth, of course. They witnessed Eleanor's isolation, observed the children who shared her features, and understood the coercive system that had created them. But enslaved people's testimony carried no legal weight in antebellum Mississippi courts. They couldn't file complaints, testify against white people in legal proceedings, or publish accounts of what they witnessed. Speaking out risked brutal punishment, sail away from family members, or death. Their knowledge was preserved only through oral tradition, passed carefully from generation to generation in whispered conversations and coded warnings. Religious institutions that might have provided moral accountability instead became complicit in the concealment. The Baptist church that baptized Eleanor's children under deliberately vague records was dependent on donations from wealthy plantation families. Reverend Samuel Dawkins, who performed those baptisms, had to balance his conscience against practical considerations. His church served enslaved people and poor whites who relied on his ministry, but his building, his salary, and his influence all depended on maintaining good relationships with powerful families like the Whitmores. Reverend Dawkins's private journals, discovered in a seminary archive in 2021, revealed his torment over the situation. In an 1851 entry he wrote, "I am called to baptize another child at Belmead, the 12th I have christened under these terrible circumstances. I know the truth of their origin, and I know it is a sin against God's law. But if I speak out, I will lose my ministry, and who will serve this flock? I pray for guidance, but I fear I am simply rationalizing my own cowardice. The Whitmore patriarch makes generous donations that feed hungry children and repair our roof. How can I refuse his requests while accepting his charity?" The Reverend's dilemma illustrated how economic dependence created chains of complicity. Teachers depended on wealthy families for students and tuition. Merchants needed plantation accounts to stay solvent. Lawyers and doctors built practices serving elite clients. Anyone who might have exposed Eleanor's exploitation had practical reasons to remain silent, creating a web of mutual protection that surrounded the Whitmore family's secret with layers of institutional defense. This systemic complicity meant that even when evidence existed, the children themselves whispered rumors, suspicious circumstances. No official investigation ever occurred. Thomas Whitmore died in 1868, taking his secrets to a grave marked by an elaborate monument celebrating his contributions to Mississippi society. No consequences ever touched him. Chapter 4. The Children's Fate and the Genealogical Trail. The 12 children captured in the 1852 photograph lived lives determined entirely by their ambiguous status, neither fully enslaved nor recognized as legitimate members of the Whitmore family. Their experiences illuminated the cruel complexities of race, class, and kinship in the antebellum South, where bloodlines could simultaneously be exploited for profit and denied for social convenience. Tracing their fates required Dr. Thornton and her research team to piece together fragments from multiple sources: post-emancipation census records, Freedmen's Bureau documents, church records, and oral histories preserved by their descendants. The oldest of Eleanor's children, a boy given the name Samuel Freeman in his baptismal record, was approximately 16 in the 1852 photograph. He appeared to have been trained as a carpenter, a skilled trade that made him valuable property. Post-Civil War records showed Samuel claiming 40 acres through the Southern Homestead Act in 1867, settling in a freedmen's community near Natchez. He married another formerly enslaved person and had children who were carefully documented in census records, a stark contrast to his own unrecorded birth. Samuel lived until 1903, dying without ever publicly acknowledging his connection to the Whitmore family. His descendants maintained that silence for generations. The younger children in the photograph followed various paths after emancipation. 3 of the girls, Mary, Ruth, and Esther Freeman, appeared in Freedmen's Bureau education records, suggesting they had received some literacy training while enslaved, another indication of their special status. Mary became a teacher in a school for formerly enslaved children, a remarkable achievement given the era's limited opportunities. Ruth married and moved to Louisiana, where her descendants still live. Esther's trail went cold after 1870. Researchers suspect she may have passed into white society, using her light complexion to escape the legal and social restrictions imposed on African Americans. Several of the boys demonstrated the skilled trades they had been taught at Belmead. James Freeman became a successful blacksmith in Natchez, accumulating modest property and gaining respect in the freedmen's community. His business ledgers, preserved by his great-granddaughter, showed he occasionally worked for white clients who had known him during slavery, though these relationships remained distant and transactional. Another boy, William, learned textile work and found employment at a cotton mill after the war, dying young from lung disease related to mill conditions. But the most tragic fate belonged to the youngest children in the photograph, those born in the mid-1850s, just as Eleanor's mental and physical health deteriorated severely. 2 children died in infancy under suspicious circumstances that were never investigated. The Whitmore family's private papers contained cryptic references to necessary losses and unfortunate outcomes, suggesting that some of Eleanor's children may have been deliberately killed if they were born with disabilities or characteristics that made them difficult to conceal or monetize. The surviving children all shared one common experience. They were separated from Eleanor soon after birth and raised in the slave quarters by other enslaved women. Eleanor was never allowed to develop maternal bonds with her children, and they grew up knowing she existed in the big house but having no relationship with her. This forced separation left psychological scars that descendants reported through generations. Oral histories collected by Dr. Thornton's team included accounts of grandchildren and great-grandchildren who grew up hearing about the sad white lady who never smiled, and understanding that there was a blood connection they could never claim. After the Civil War ended and Reconstruction began, the children faced a painful dilemma. They could potentially seek legal recognition as Eleanor's children and claim inheritance rights to the Whitmore estate. Several civil rights activists and Freedmen's Bureau agents encouraged them to pursue such claims, arguing that they were entitled to portions of the wealth their labor and existence had helped generate. But pursuing such claims meant exposing the circumstances of their births, publicly acknowledging that their mother had been forced into a breeding program by her own father. None of Eleanor's children ever filed formal claims against the Whitmore estate. Whether this was due to shame, fear of retaliation, lack of legal representation, or simply wanting to move forward with their lives remains unclear. Thomas Whitmore's sons, Eleanor's legitimate half-brothers, inherited the plantation and made the token provisions for the dependents mentioned in the probate records. These provisions amounted to small parcels of marginal land and modest cash payments, a fraction of what legitimate heirs would have received, but more than most formerly enslaved people obtained. The genealogical trail that connected these 12 individuals back to Eleanor required extraordinary detective work. Dr. Thornton's team used DNA analysis on descendants who agreed to participate, confirming maternal lineages that traced back to the Whitmore family. The genetic evidence proved what documents had been designed to conceal. Eleanor Whitmore was mother to children whose existence had been systematically erased from official records, but preserved in the bodies and memories of their descendants. Perhaps most poignantly, researchers discovered that several of the children had kept small mementos that connected them to their hidden heritage. One woman, believed to be one of the daughters in the photograph, was buried with a handkerchief embroidered with the initials E.W. Her granddaughter, interviewed in the 1960s as part of an oral history project, recalled that her grandmother would never explain who E.W. was, only that the handkerchief was the only thing I have for my mother. Another descendant possessed a small Bible with an inscription in elegant handwriting. "To my children, may God grant you the freedom I never knew." E.W., 1856. These fragments of memory and material culture provided the only acknowledgement Eleanor was allowed to make of her maternal relationship to the children she had been forced to bear. Chapter 5. Eleanor's Final Years and the Great Silence. Eleanor Whitmore lived for 59 years, dying in 1884, 16 years after her father's death, and nearly 2 decades after the Civil War ended slavery. Her final years were marked by profound isolation, deteriorating mental health, and the bitter irony that emancipation freed the people who shared her blood while she remained imprisoned by family control and social convention. Understanding Eleanor's experience requires examining not just the documented facts of her life, but the silences, absences, and erasures that characterized how history remembered, or deliberately forgot, women in her position. After Thomas Whitmore's death in 1868, control of Eleanor passed to her brothers, who inherited the plantation and its remaining assets. The Civil War had devastated Belmead's economy. The cotton fields that once produced enormous profits lay fallow, and the forced labor system that had generated the family's wealth had been dismantled. But the Whitmore brothers retained enough resources to maintain the big house and provide for Eleanor's continued confinement within it. She was never granted independence or autonomy, despite being a 43-year-old woman when her father died. Contemporary accounts from this period are frustratingly sparse. Eleanor essentially vanished from public life. She appeared in no census records after 1870, even though she was clearly alive and residing in Mississippi. Her brothers ensured she remained invisible to official documentation, perhaps fearing that any scrutiny might expose the family's secrets. Servants who worked at the deteriorating plantation during Reconstruction occasionally mentioned the old mistress upstairs, or Miss Eleanor who keeps to her rooms, but these references were always brief and carefully neutral. One of the few detailed accounts came from a formerly enslaved woman named Martha Jenkins, who worked as Eleanor's attendant from 1865 until Eleanor's death in 1884. Martha's testimony was recorded in 1902 by a researcher collecting oral histories from formerly enslaved people. Her account painted a heartbreaking portrait of Eleanor's final years. According to Martha, Eleanor rarely left her suite of rooms on the second floor. She spent her days sitting by the window, looking out over what had once been Belmead's grounds, now partially abandoned and overgrown. Martha described Eleanor as the saddest white lady I ever knew, just sitting and staring, barely eating, rarely speaking except to herself. She reported that Eleanor would sometimes call out names, the names of her children, particularly late at night when she thought no one was listening. She'd call for Samuel and Mary and Ruth, saying their names like prayers, Martha recalled. But none of them ever came to see her. They were free by then, living their own lives, and I don't think she blamed them. She knew what had been done to her and to them. The most devastating detail in Martha's account concerned Eleanor's reaction when she learned about emancipation. When news reached Belmead that enslaved people were legally free, Eleanor reportedly asked Martha, "Does that mean I'm free too?" Martha said the question broke her heart, because she realized Eleanor understood she had never been free, even though she was white and wealthy. Eleanor's prison had been one of gender, family control, and social convention rather than legal slavery, but it was a prison nonetheless. Eleanor's relationship with her own children became one of the great tragedies of her story. After emancipation, several of her children remained in the Natchez area, building new lives as free people. They would have known where their mother was. The Whitmore plantation was well known, and Eleanor's presence there was an open secret in certain communities. But there is no evidence that any of them ever attempted to visit or establish contact with her. The psychological damage of their births, the shame and trauma associated with their origins, and perhaps simple self-preservation kept them away. Dr. Thornton's research uncovered one poignant exception to this estrangement. In 1879, a woman named Ruth Freeman, almost certainly one of Eleanor's daughters, was reported by a Natchez newspaper to have been arrested for trespassing on the Whitmore property. The brief article noted that she was removed from the premises by local authorities at the request of the Whitmore brothers and warned never to return. No further details were provided, but descendants' oral histories suggested Ruth had attempted to see Eleanor and was forcibly prevented from doing so. Eleanor's brothers maintained strict control over who could access her, likely fearing that contact with her children might lead to legal claims against the family estate or public revelation of Thomas Whitmore's crimes. They positioned themselves as Eleanor's protectors, arguing that she was mentally unstable and required isolation for her own welfare. This narrative of female insanity was convenient for concealing the truth, that Eleanor was being silenced to protect the family's reputation and financial interests. The circumstances of Eleanor's death in 1884 were as obscure as much of her life. No obituary appeared in local newspapers, unusual for someone from such a prominent family. Her death certificate, filed in county records, listed the cause as natural decline, with no attending physician named. She was buried in the Whitmore family plot, but her gravestone was modest compared to her father's elaborate monument, bearing only her name and dates with no epitaph or tribute. Even in death, she remained marginalized and silenced. In the decades following Eleanor's death, The Whitmore family actively worked to erase any remaining traces of the scandal. Letters were destroyed, documents were removed from family papers before they were donated to historical societies, and family members were discouraged from discussing Eleanor at all. By the early 20th century, when genealogists began compiling family histories, Eleanor was often omitted entirely or mentioned only as an unmarried daughter who lived quietly at the family home. This great silence, enforced by legal mechanisms, social pressure, family control, and deliberate destruction of evidence, nearly succeeded in erasing Eleanor's story entirely. It took the accidental discovery of a single photograph, combined with painstaking research across multiple archives and oral history collections, to finally piece together the truth that so many people had worked so hard to conceal. Chapter 6. The Revelation and What Experts Found. When Dr. Rebecca Thornton published her initial findings about Eleanor Whitmore and the 1852 photograph in the Journal of Southern History in early 2020, the response was immediate and profound. Historians recognized that the case opened a window into practices that had long been suspected but rarely documented. The systematic exploitation of white women deemed unmarriageable within wealthy families, and the use of forced reproduction to increase enslaved labor forces while manipulating family bloodlines. But the full scope of what experts discovered went far beyond a single tragic story. It revealed patterns of abuse that had been hidden across the antebellum South. The photograph itself became the subject of intense analysis. Forensic photo analysts studied the image using modern enhancement techniques, revealing details invisible to the naked eye. The children's expressions showed signs of profound distress, what trauma specialists identified as dissociative features consistent with chronic abuse. Eleanor's body language suggested severe depression and possibly cognitive impairment, raising questions about whether she had been medicated or sedated to maintain her compliance with her father's scheme. The formal composition of the photograph, clearly taken by a professional, suggested Thomas Whitmore had commissioned it deliberately, perhaps as a private record of his success in achieving his eugenic and economic goals. DNA analysis conducted with the cooperation of living descendants confirmed the maternal connection between Eleanor and her children, but revealed something even more disturbing. Genetic markers showed that the 12 children had at least 7 different fathers, all of whom traced their ancestry to West African populations, consistent with enslaved people brought to Mississippi plantations. The genetic diversity among fathers suggested Thomas Whitmore had indeed been selecting different enslaved men to father children with his daughter, treating the entire process as a deliberate breeding program aimed at producing enslaved workers with specific physical characteristics. Medical historians analyzing the timeline of Eleanor's pregnancies and births found evidence of severe health consequences. Eleanor gave birth 12 times in 14 years, a punishing schedule that would have devastated her physical and mental health, even under the best circumstances. Records of purchases made by Thomas Whitmore included large quantities of laudanum and other opiates, suggesting Eleanor may have been kept in a semi-sedated state to manage pain, depression, or resistance. The pattern of purchases increased dramatically during the years of her pregnancies, pointing to a calculated strategy of chemical control. Legal scholars examining the case identified multiple violations of laws that existed even in the antebellum South. While enslaved people had almost no legal protections, white women, even those under male authority, possessed certain rights that Eleanor's father and brothers violated. They had effectively imprisoned her without legal commitment proceedings, denied her control over her own person, and manipulated her reproduction without consent. However, the legal system's complete failure to intervene or investigate revealed how thoroughly gender, class, and race intersected to create zones of absolute patriarchal authority where such abuses could occur with impunity. Perhaps most significantly, Dr. Thornton's research team discovered that the Whitmore case was not unique. Using the patterns identified at Belmead as a template, researchers began searching other archives for similar cases. They found fragmentary evidence of at least 17 comparable situations across Mississippi, Louisiana, Georgia, and South Carolina. In each case, wealthy families with unmarried daughters who were deemed unmarriageable had created similar breeding programs. exploiting both their daughters and enslaved men to produce children who would increase the family's enslaved labor force while maintaining deniable distance from legitimate family lines. These discoveries challenged long-held assumptions about antebellum Southern society. Historians had documented how enslaved women were systematically raped to produce children who would be enslaved, a practice that was both morally reprehensible and economically motivated. But the exploitation of white women in similar breeding schemes had remained largely hidden, perhaps because it contradicted the romanticized narratives of Southern gentility and white womanhood that dominated popular historical memory. Eleanor's story forced a reckoning with the reality that elite white women could also be reduced to reproductive commodities within a system organized around maximizing wealth through human exploitation. The descendants of Eleanor's children responded to these revelations with mixed emotions. Some felt vindication. Finally, their family histories were being acknowledged, and the truth their grandparents had whispered about was being confirmed by scholarly research. They could claim their connection to the Whitmore family, even if that connection was born from trauma and exploitation. Others felt re-traumatized by the public exposure of their ancestors' origins, preferring that the shameful circumstances remain private. In 2023, several descendants organized a memorial ceremony at the site where Belmead once stood. The plantation house had burned in the 1920s and the land had been subdivided and sold, but the family cemetery remained, including Eleanor's modest grave. Descendants gathered to honor both Eleanor and the 12 children she had been forced to bear. They placed flowers on her grave and held a ceremony that finally acknowledged the maternal relationship that had been denied for 170 years. One descendant, Samuel Freeman's great-great-granddaughter, read a statement. "Eleanor Whitmore was our ancestor, our grandmother many generations removed. She was a victim of her father's cruelty, just as our ancestors who were enslaved were victims. We honor her memory, and we name what was done to her and to them. It was abuse, exploitation, and rape. We will not let shame or social convention silence this truth any longer. If this story has gripped you, leave a like. It helps Eleanor's story reach more people and ensures these silenced histories aren't forgotten again." The Whitmore case continues to inform contemporary discussions about reproductive justice, bodily autonomy, and the long shadow of slavery's legacy. Eleanor's children and their descendants numbered in the hundreds by 2025, forming family networks that span multiple states. Many had been unaware of their connection until DNA testing and genealogical research revealed the truth. The photograph that started this revelation, Eleanor surrounded by 12 children whose existence official history tried to erase, now stands as testament to truths that refuse to stay buried, no matter how many people work to conceal them. Subscribe to the channel to discover more forbidden and forgotten histories. Thank you for following Eleanor Whitmore's case and the 12 children whose existence was denied for 170 years. See you in the next video.